Starting next week, South Korea will go mask-free on buses and subways. Now with the mask mandate lifted almost everywhere, what is left from now? The heads of South Korea and Japan are set to meet tomorrow, seeking breakthrough momentum in bilateral relations. We have the possible agendas and prospects. The slowing economy is taking its toll on the job market, with South Korea's newly employed people last month the fewest in 2 years. Good afternoon. We begin with a much-anticipated announcement earlier this morning. South Korea will go mask-free on buses and subways starting next week. This means the mask mandate has been lifted almost everywhere, and all the pandemic restrictions are scrapped except for the mandatory isolation for those infected. Our Kim Jung-sil has the details.
From next week, people in South Korea will no longer be required to wear a mask when using public transport. The mask mandate on public transport has been in place for about 2 years and 5 months. It is one of the last remaining indoor mask mandates after the South Korean government lifted the mandate for most indoor places at the end of January, except for a few places such as hospitals, care facilities, and pharmacies. Speaking of pharmacies, the government has also decided to lift the mask rules for pharmacies that are inside supermarkets or stations. Back in January, when the government lifted the indoor mask mandate, people still had to put one back on when using pharmacies in those places, which experts saw as ineffective. Although the mask mandate will be lifted for public transport and for specific pharmacies from next Monday, the government still suggests senior citizens or those with pre-existing conditions keep wearing masks. People who use public transport during rush hour are also recommended to wear a mask, as well as those with COVID-19 symptoms. South Korea is likely to completely lift the mask mandate in all places and adjust the self-isolation period from the current 7 days only after the World Health Organization lifts the global emergency declaration at the end of April or early May. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
Turning over to diplomacy, President Yoon is set to visit Japan tomorrow, seeking momentum in Seoul-Tokyo ties that have been strained in recent years. Eyes are on whether this could pave the way for more exchanges and perhaps a visit by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to South Korea. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young reports.
South Korea and Japan are set to normalize their bilateral relations with a breakthrough summit in Tokyo. Ahead of President Yoon Suk-yeol's working visit to Japan, National Security Advisor Kim Sung-han said the South Korean leader and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will discuss all areas of bilateral ties to break the vicious cycle of spiraling relations between the neighbors, which fell to a critical low 4 years ago. At the core of their talks will be resolving the trade dispute triggered in 2019, when Japan slapped controls on exports of key chip materials to Seoul. This followed a Korean court ruling that ordered Japanese firms to compensate the Koreans they subjected to forced labor before and during World War II. After Seoul announced this month a plan to compensate the Korean victims of forced labor through private funding without demanding reparations from Japanese firms, Yoon and Kishida will discuss follow-up measures to move forward. Stabilizing military intel sharing will also be discussed, as the practice became rocky under the previous Moon and Abe administrations.
There will be an opportunity to discuss ways to resolve policy barriers and deepen economic cooperation between the two countries. Through this summit and a dinner event, the two leaders can affirm their will to enhance bilateral relations as they build mutual trust on a personal level.
Yoon's schedule will begin with a lunch with Korean nationals, followed by a summit and state dinner with Kishida. Tokyo-based media says Kishida is likely to make a rare move of hospitality, treating Yoon to a two-pot dinner of Japanese beef stew and an omelette-topped rice dish known to be enjoyed by the South Korean leader. On Friday morning, Yoon will greet bilateral friendship groups and sit down for a roundtable and lunch with business leaders from both countries. Signifying the focus on future-oriented ties, the president will give a lecture to Korean and Japanese students at Keio University. as Yoon moves to restore top-level exchanges between the two countries since 2011. Kodo News says Kishida is considering inviting Yoon to the G7 summit in May and making a reciprocal visit to Seoul afterwards. All eyes are now on whether the Yoon-Kishida meeting will result in a joint statement that turns their determination to improve bilateral ties into practical action. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Now, as mentioned in the previous report, the developments on the Seoul-Tokyo summit moved quickly after Seoul announced a solution to the long-standing issue surrounding Japan's wartime forced labor. But there are a lot of other issues on the table. Our Kim Do-yeon has the possible agendas.
President Yoon Suk-yeol's diplomatic capabilities will be put to test as he heads to Japan for the first summit in Tokyo for a Korean president in 12 years. So what are some gains that President Yoon can make during this important trip?
The two leaders will discuss ways to normalize bilateral ties on all fronts, including what comes after our announcement of a solution for compensating Korean victims of Japan's forced labor, and they will exchange their opinions on various issues.
The announcement for the visit to Japan came just 3 days after South Korea proposed a solution to the core issue at hand for the cold relations, compensating Korean victims of Japan's forced wartime labor. That said, this may open ways to address immediate issues. This includes Japan returning to South Korea to the white list of preferred trading partners. Experts also say efforts to improve bilateral ties by Seoul and Tokyo are in the interest of the U.S. as well.
The direct results of the compensation plans seems to focus on the cooperation of South Korea, the US and Japan in security. The US has shown a strong drive for trilateral cooperation, so the summit will include different topics, but at the core, it will be trilateral cooperation.
And also on the agenda could be Seoul asking for Japan's support for joining the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, also known as the Quad, a strategic group comprised of the US, Japan, India, and Australia.
Of course, we would aim for being part of working groups of the Quad. Becoming a full member wouldn't be easy. But within the group, there are 3 working groups such as for semiconductors and rare earths, as well as pandemic response.
South Korean officials have said Seoul could play a role in the Quad's working groups, spanning areas from maritime security and supply chains to semiconductor technology. As the question of economic security becomes all the more important, Seoul and Tokyo have shown eagerness to forge greater cooperation. The president's security advisor also said changes in the two governments' stance toward each other could lead to more civilian exchanges with greater business and tourism between the two countries. That, he said, comes from trust, one of the most important assets in diplomacy. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
And on to the latest news related to compensating Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. South Korea's biggest steelmaker POSCO has donated 4 billion Korean won, or some $3 million US, to the Foundation for Victims of Forced Mobilization by Imperial Japan. The company announced Wednesday that it had voluntarily given the remaining 4 billion of the 10 billion won it vowed to donate back in 2012. POSCO said it had now fulfilled its promise, having donated 3 billion won in both 2016 and 2017. Earlier this month, the South Korean government announced a plan to compensate victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through a foundation funded by Korean companies that were established partially using Japanese funds under the 1965 Normalization Treaty. POSCO, being one of them, becomes the first company to contribute since the government announced the plan. In other news, North Korea continues with its show of protests against the ongoing Seoul-Washington joint drills. On top of launching 2 ballistic missiles yesterday, the region confirms that it fired 2 ground-to-ground ballistic missiles the same day. The U.S. responded with a strong warning. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
Following Tuesday morning's report that North Korea fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the East Sea, North Korea's state media said Wednesday it had fired 2 medium-range ground-to-ground ballistic missiles. The Korean Central News Agency also released photos showing the KN-23, the North Korean version of the Russian Iskander, being launched from a transporter erector launcher. KCNA added that the missiles were launched from Changyeon County in South Hwanghae Province, with the missiles hitting their target some 611 kilometers away. The latest provocation is widely considered to be in response to the Freedom Shield military exercise currently taking place between South Korea and the United States. Meanwhile, a U.S. Department of Defense spokesperson said Tuesday that any use of nuclear weapons by Pyongyang will mean the end of the regime. Speaking at a daily press briefing, Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Pat Ryder issued Washington's latest warning against any use of such weapons after North Korea last year enacted a new law that would allow preemptive use of its nuclear weapons when deemed necessary. Ryder also stressed that the U.S. remains committed to deterring North Korea's continued aggression, adding that the U.S. and its allies in the Indo-Pacific region will continue to cooperate closely to preserve security and stability in the region. 이 승재, Arirang News.
President Yoon has plans to establish the world's largest system semiconductor cluster in the Seoul metropolitan area. In an emergency economic meeting held on Wednesday, Yoon said almost $230 billion worth of private investment will be used to complete the project. He also urged the private sector to invest over $421 billion in 6 high-tech industries, including chips and secondary batteries, adding that 14 new industrial complexes will also be created across the country. The president also discussed 6 tasks to boost high-tech industries with related ministers, including the nurturing of talent and creating an environment-friendly environment. South Korea's slowing economy is taking its toll on the job market, with the country's newly employed people last month the fewest in 2 years. Yoon has the details.
In 2022, an average of 816,000 more people per month were in employment compared to the previous year, driven by the post-pandemic recovery. But according to new data compiled by Statistics Korea, job recovery is forecast to lose steam this year amid the economic slowdown. There were 27.71 million people in employment last month, up around 312,000 from a year earlier. This is the smallest increase since February 2021, when the figure was 473,000. February's data shows that South Korea's monthly job additions continue to slow for the 9th consecutive month since June of 2022, when 841,000 jobs were added. Year on year, it was people aged 60 and above who made up the majority of new workers, with some 413,000 jobs. The number of jobs for those in their 20s dropped 94,000, and the figure was 77,000 for those in their 40s. The unemployment rate for South Koreans between the ages of 15 and 29 reached 7% in February, up 0.1 percentage points on year. New jobs were mainly created in the welfare, accommodation, restaurant, and communication industries, with 192,000 hired in the welfare sector and 176,000 in the accommodation and restaurant industries. On the other hand, jobs were lost in the retail, wholesale, transportation, and agricultural sectors. The total unemployment rate in February came to 3.1%, 0.3% lower than the previous year, which also marks the lowest February figure in 24 years. Yoon, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., the country's inflation last month continued slow but gradual cooling trend. Now, eyes are on what this will mean for the upcoming rate decision by the Fed, which has the recent failure of regional banks to consider. Our Shin Se-byuk has this report.
U.S. consumer prices once again eased last month. In February, the consumer price index dropped to 6% from 6.4% in January. It is encouraging given that it is the 8th consecutive month showing a year-on-year slowdown, and also a significant drop from the peak of over 9% seen in June last year. The fluttering headline rate is mostly due to a fall in energy prices and deflation in the used car market, followed by a post-pandemic recovery in the supply chain. Core CPI, without volatile food and energy prices, continued to rise at an uncomfortably fast pace in February. It increased by 0.5% last month, an acceleration from the 0.4% jump recorded a month earlier. The rising cost of shelter, which accounts for over 70% of the total rise in prices, was a significant contributor. In February, it rose by another 0.8%. Meanwhile, even with signs of headline inflation easing, the Federal Reserve is widely expected to go ahead with another rate hike next week, potentially another 25 basis point hike. This is because inflation remains at 3 times the Fed's target of 2%, and despite the recent failure of regional banks in the U.S.
The real question for everyone is thinking about the Fed's direction all the way through May and June as it relates to, do we get to have a series of 25? But I think everybody's decided it's pretty much 25 this time due to the bank scare.
Despite the 6% inflation figure, U.S. stocks ended higher on Tuesday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed up 1.1%, the S&P 500 up 1.7%, and the Nasdaq Composite over 2% up. 신새벽, Arirang News.
South Korea's southern port city of Busan plans to step up its monitoring procedures in response to Japan's planned release of wastewater from its destroyed Fukushima nuclear power plant. The city will install additional real-time monitoring systems to check radiation levels in seawater and purchase more radiation analysis devices for food safety. The collected data will be posted on the city government's website and its social networking accounts. Currently, there are still 1.3 million tons of contaminated water stored at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The Japanese government plans to begin releasing the water this spring or summer. Now on to some positive changes on youth policy. South Korea is bringing in younger generations to take part in policy making so that those policies can better cater to their needs. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-hoo reports.
In Korean, the term for young people or youth is 청년, or translated literally, one's bright and green years. But data show that reality for today's youth isn't always so bright. Survey results released March 7 show that more than 1 in 3 young people have experienced burnout in the last 12 months. Recent studies also show that more than 1 in 5 young people have debts amounting to more than 3 times their annual income. To support these youth facing various challenges, South Korea has come up with new policies. In late February, South Korea's National Assembly passed what's called the Framework Act on Youth. The act aims to encourage young people to participate in politics, as well as proposing policies with young people in mind. The act requires all government committees to include a certain number of young people, whereas previously this was required only for committees dealing with youth policies. It also calls for easier access to the list of policies relevant to young people and for regional youth centers to make available information on those policies. At the National Assembly, many lawmakers are also working hard to provide opportunities for the young generation to participate in politics. One of these lawmakers is Kim Sung-ju. Beginning this month, he's running a program where young people get to be his honorary aides. The young aides are giving suggestions for new laws.
We will actively reflect in our lawmaking process these suggestions from young people who help us see the problems in our society and how the future should be.
Mr. Kim Won-soo, who served as the head of the Young Generation Committee of Yeonsu-gu District in Incheon City, is also a current leader of a political group called Young People Together. He said that more voices are needed from the young generation to change our political structure, which caters more to the elder generation.
The structure right now is made for the older generations who actively participate in politics. The more we participate in politics, the more voices from the young generation can be heard.
With about a year left to the general election, policies for the young must continue to be developed not only for the results of the election, but for the future of our country. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the Black Sea, a United States drone was reportedly forced down into the water after an encounter with 2 Russian fighter jets. According to the U.S. military, the American MQ-9 Reaper drone ended up in the water on Tuesday local time after its propeller was reportedly damaged by one of 2 Russian Su-27s. The downing occurred over international waters when the drone was met by 2 Russian aircraft while carrying out routine operations. U.S. reports say that over the course of 30 to 40 minutes, one of the jets dumped fuel on the drone multiple times and flew in front of it, and eventually made physical contact with its propeller. But Russia has said that the drone was traveling with its transponders turned off, which meant the aircraft could not be tracked. The Kremlin also denied that the 2 aircraft made contact, saying that the drone crashed after a supposed sharp maneuver. Turning to the tech sector now, where Meta is set to lay off 10,000 of its employees and will leave 5,000 of its empty positions unfilled. According to CEO Mark Zuckerberg on Tuesday, the job cuts will take place over the next several months. He added that it comes amid higher U.S. interest rates, instability in global geopolitics, and increased regulations. The layoff is the second major round of job cuts by Facebook's parent company in just 4 months. It means that Meta's staff count will soon be 66,000, marking a 25% workforce reduction since the first layoffs were announced. The layoffs come amid a series of job cuts across the tech industry. According to a tech layoff tracker, the tech sector has seen 128,000 job cuts this year alone. And finally, Libyans across the country gathered in the city of Sabratha last Friday to celebrate National Couscous Day with a giant version of the country's staple food. Measuring at 4 meters in diameter, the dish weighed some 2,500 kilograms and contained the meat of 5 camels. The making of the dish marked the 3rd time Libya has held the day. Made from semolina or corn wheat, couscous is consumed across countries in North Africa and is usually combined with meat and vegetables. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. There has been a big rise in highs in the southern provinces, easily surpassing 20 degrees Celsius, while the capital region is having slightly lower highs this afternoon under cloudier skies. Wet clouds are forecast to drop spotty rain in the northern parts of Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do. Central regions will see less rainfall, which will not be enough to ease the dryness in the air. Seoul, south of Gyeonggi-do and parts of the south remain under a dry weather advisory. And what's more, strong wind will also boost the risk of wildfire. In fact, mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province are under a strong wind advisory as well. Now, those in the south are having a warm day with partly sunny skies. Air quality stays decent during the day before going up to bad levels tonight in Chungcheong-do and Jeollabuk-do provinces. Our morning temperatures will drop to near freezing for the next few days, so please be mindful of more temperature swings and do dress accordingly. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of the day.